evening, everyone. My name is Professor Michael Salter, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this incredibly important discussion tonight, where we are grappling with, I think, the critical national priority of our age, and we're really lucky to be joined by some excellent speakers tonight who are really at the cutting edge of this issue. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Bidjigal people, who are the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet tonight. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us. So thank you also for coming to join us for this discussion. To acknowledge in the audience, we have UNSW staff, we have students, we have alumni, and we have the broader UNSW community. This event is being held tonight as part of UNSW Sydney's Diversity Festival. And each year, UNSW hosts a flagship event as part of the festival. The Diversity Festival is now in its 7th year. It is UNSW's Equity, Diversity and Inclusion flagship event, bringing together students, staff and the wider community to uplift voices from diverse backgrounds and ignite conversations for a more inclusive society. And one of the forces that really pushes people to the margins and outside of our society is, of course, gender-based violence. I first came to UNSW 20 years ago, where I worked in public health and the prevention of bloodborne viruses, and graduated from UNSW with a PhD in public health in 2010. And it was around that time in 2010 that Australia as a country began to think about gender-based violence as a preventable epidemic, as a problem, a grand social problem that we could tackle collectively through strategic investment and action at all levels of community, business and society. And so really over the last 15 years, I've been watching as Australia at a Commonwealth level, at a state level and community level has been looking to build that architecture in order to bring gender-based violence to an end. And I'm now the director of the East Asia and Pacific Hub of Childlight, the Global Child Safety Institute, based in the School of Social Sciences here at the University of New South Wales, where we apply public health principles to end child sexual abuse in particular. But here in UNSW, we have other flagship institutes, the Australian Human Rights Institute, which works with scholars here in Australia and around the world to address gender equality and gender-based violence. We also, in the School of Social Sciences, have the Gendered Violence Research Network, the largest network of its kind, which really specialises in practice and policy-focused research and knowledge translation to bring violence to an end. So I think UNSW is a very suitable host for our discussion tonight. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's guests. Your host for tonight is award-winning journalist Sarah Malik. Sarah is a Walkley Award-winning Australian investigative journalist, author and TV broadcaster. Her work explores asylum, surveillance, technology, and their intersection with gender and race, with a focus on domestic violence, gender, inequality, and migration. Sarah graduated from the University of Technology, Sydney, with degrees in law and journalism, and she has taught journalism at Monash University. She's now a PhD student with us at the University of New South Wales. Our keynote speaker is Professor Jess Hill. Jess is a journalist, an author, a speaker, an academic who focuses primarily on social issues and gendered violence. Jess started her career almost 15 years ago as a producer for ABC Radio, and she went on to become a Middle East correspondent for the Global Mail, and then an investigative journalist for Background Briefing. Her reporting has won 2 Walkley Awards, an Amnesty International Award, and 3 Our Watch Awards. Jess's first book, See What You Made Me Do, on the phenomenon of domestic abuse and coercive control, was released in 2019 and was awarded the 2020 Stella Prize. And I think we cannot underestimate the impact that Jess's work, and particularly her book, has had on the national and international discussion on domestic violence. and really pushing us to consider in a much more mature and sophisticated way the controlling dynamics that enmesh women within experiences and relationships of violence and abuse. In 2021, the book was adapted into a series on SBS, and recent projects include a podcast series on coercive control and patriarchy called The Trap, and a quarterly essay this year on how Me Too has changed Australia, titled The Reckoning. And I would also commend Jess's more recent quarterly essay in 2025, really examining some of the missed opportunities for prevention and primary prevention that I'm sure Jess will be touching on tonight. Since the book was released, Jess has spoken at almost 300 public events. I am sure that is an underestimate. 300 public events about coercive control, and she regularly conducts training and education for groups as diverse as magistrates, high school students, workplaces, and local councils. Those of us who know Jess well know that there's a lot of her work that's public-facing, but there's so much of her work that is private and it's unknown. And I know that she works tirelessly for this cause in ways that people often don't see. Luckily, we will have the benefit of some of her more visible presentation tonight. Following the event, both Sarah and Jess will be signing books in the foyer. At the Diversity Festival, we like to surprise and delight. So now is the time to look under your seats. You will not be getting a free car, but there are 10 vouchers for free books, which can be exchanged tonight at the bookshop. If we don't get all 10, there are some spare seats, so you might want to just keep looking. I'm hearing some murmurings of surprise. So now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Jess to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh my God. Saying to Sarah, that was the long bio. I didn't even know people sent them out anymore. Anyway, thank you so much, Mike. That was a really gorgeous and thorough introduction, and thank you all of you for being here. I too want to acknowledge the Bidjigal people. This is land that I also live on, and the traditional custodians of this land. Pay my respect to the elders, past and present. They're stolen lands, and they were never ceded. And in this work, you are immersed in the facts of what happens to Aboriginal women and kids every day. And Aboriginal women and kids are disproportionately targeted by offenders. And systemic racism and misogyny makes them even more vulnerable. Their resilience and resistance strategies can be extraordinary, but they shouldn't actually have to live like that. And ending gender-based violence means providing real safety, culturally safe services, and actually resourcing systems and communities to properly support victim survivor mothers to heal with their children wherever possible, not simply removing those children and subjecting them to the trauma of living in out-of-home care. Because as we know, too often that's leading to exploitation, abuse, and for too many, a crossover into incarceration. Now, tonight, I'm here to talk about Australia's incredibly bold promise to end gender-based violence in a single generation. Anyone old enough to remember Bob Hawke will remember his promise that no child would be living in poverty. He actually put some good infrastructure around that promise. He did try. It didn't quite pan out. But I like to think of it as net zero violence by 2050. And every government has signed up to this, but I suspect that few policymakers have truly grasped what that commitment will take. So right up the top, I'm just going to plot spoil and say I'm actually not going to lay out a 20-minute roadmap for how to end gender-based violence, because this is violence that has taken root over generations, much of it fed by social dynamics that landed with the tall ships over 240 years ago. It's spread like an invasive weed. There's no simple way to eradicate this, and anyone who's had to deal with lantana will know that. But I think we can get closer to understanding how to go about ending it if we make a radical change in the way that we think about solving it. And I'm fairly confident, as a chronic self-doubter, at least on this day, and that is the 24th of September 2025, that if we did some of this, I think we could make this country a safer and happier place. So before I begin, and I am using PowerPoint for like the fourth time in my life, so just apologies if the slides actually don't change when they're supposed to. It's not their technology, it's my brain. But I just want to recap briefly. So over the last couple of years, Professor Mike Salter and I, we've been trying to raise the alarm on what the data shows is there's no nice way to put it. It feels like a failing approach. Not failing in every area, but failing in too many areas. So we presented on this and made a lot of friends in 2023. And then last year, we released a paper called Rethinking Primary Prevention, which attracted enormous media attention and was quite a ride for us. It was also quite persuasive for the Albanese government and contributed to this decision to commission a rapid review into prevention, which I sat on. And today, actually, quite coincidentally, our 6-member panel had a briefing from Ministers Tanya Plibersek and Katie Gallagher on what progress is being made on those recommendations. And sort of like a duck in a pond, like looks very placid on top, but there is actually quite a lot going on under the surface. I'm happy to talk more about that in the conversation if we get there. But essentially, that Mike, myself, the Rapid Review and others were really urging policymakers to grapple with hard truths about what is working and what is not working. And I think there's certainly some alarming data. So, just a brief snapshot. Thank you for that auditory assistance. That was really dramatic. So, we've got police call-outs for domestic and family violence. They've doubled in a decade, from a call every 2 minutes to one every minute. So domestic and family violence is consuming around 40 to 60% of New South Wales police time, and in some areas that percentage is much higher. As to whether that's because there are a higher rate of reports, or whether there's more severe and complex domestic violence that is requiring police intervention is hard to say. We actually don't have clear data on that. But what we can say is that sexual violence reports, they are at a 31-year high, and yet the rate of victims who are reporting their most recent sexual assault has fallen by a third. So we can't say that it's at a 31-year high because there is an increased rate of reporting. There is no increased rate of reporting in sexual violence, but there is an increase in the sexual violence crime rate. Coercive control is becoming more common and sophisticated, especially tech-facilitated abuse. Could spend 20 minutes talking about all of the various ways that happens. But just one example is that the number of women who told the Personal Safety Survey that they were being tracked in some way by an ex-partner jumped from 455,000 to 641,000 in just 5 years. And then in 2023, after a long period of steady decline from like the late 80s, apparently largely due to improvements in medical interventions and ambulance response times, domestic homicides spiked by 28%, which unfortunately for the government, and I do not mean to sound crass, but that is literally the target that they had for reducing intimate partner homicides each year. So it went in the exact reverse. And the data on young people, which I'll come to shortly, is I think even more alarming. And I think when we see results stagnating or going backwards in areas of public health, we actually have a responsibility to re-examine our assumptions and ask what we're missing. And we should do that regularly no matter what. Because imagine, neuroscientists who say, well, we released a framework in 2014 and we're sticking with it. So we don't care what was released in the brain research since then. It's a good framework. That would be an error. So evidence evolves and changes, and as does the social environment that we're working in. And I don't think we should be afraid to interrogate the evidence that's informed our positions, even if we have to change our position, which is actually a sign of maturity. We should bring a healthy amount of doubt to this work, make sure we're asking the right questions, and always be willing to challenge both accepted wisdom and anything that becomes a sacred cow. This, I think, applies to pretty much any area, and I'm sure many of the areas that you all work in tonight. So we've seen Australia demonstrate this kind of courage in other areas. Some examples of harm reduction in drugs, going from this like clear abstinence approach to actually having injecting rooms in some areas, still very spotty. Bold regulations on tobacco. But I think most persuasively, and this is something that I learnt from Mike, is it was done in HIV prevention, that we had this pivot from one strategy to another that was really courageous and showed incredible results. And Mike told me about this. I'm probably bitching about prevention, as we commonly did, years ago. And he just casually mentioned this in passing. And I just never forgot it. And it was always in the back of my mind, what was that thing that happened in HIV prevention? Something happened. And I feel like it says something about where we're at now. And so when we were talking about this in 2023, I said, can you take me through what happened? And then when he told me, I'm like, oh my God, that's such a great analogy. So I'm just going to repeat the bare bones of that today. Mike does a much more thorough going over given his background. But I just want to help set the scene for how we're trying to rethink things. So essentially, back in the 1990s, HIV prevention messaging was really simple. It was like, wear a condom, save your life, save your partner's life. And it worked for a while, but from the late 90s onwards, that message started to lose its power. And as Mike explained, HIV medication was getting better, so it wasn't such a death sentence. But also people were kind of tired of hearing just wear a condom all the time. So when infection rates started to rise again, the HIV prevention sector did something really bold, and they pivoted dramatically to take a simple message on condoms and replace it with a new and much more complex message. And that is, if you're negative, get tested and get tested often. If you're negative, go on PrEP, and one pill will dramatically reduce your chances of infection. If you're positive, take medication, drop your viral load, and then you won't transmit. And the messaging on testing and treatment was delivered directly to the community most affected and then backed with resources. And it worked, like literally within a single generation. Sydney, which is one of the global epicenters of this epidemic, it's now on the brink of eliminating HIV altogether. And of course, the results have been uneven. Unsurprisingly, in some of the outer suburbs, there's been less access to testing and treatment. Infection rates have only dropped by around a third, and cold and Indigenous communities have been hit hardest. So, resourcing and consistency matters. But within a generation, HIV has all but been eliminated in Sydney. And I think, imagine if the sector had refused to pivot and just dug its heels in on the condoms approach, because too much has been invested in that approach and we can't risk losing that. Where would we be now? So every government in Australia has also promised to end violence against women and children within a generation. And that might make you scratch your head. Maybe you think it sounds absurd, and that would be fair for many reasons. But, as Mike reminded us, when we were first doing this, back in 1999, no one in the HIV prevention sector would have imagined that within just 25 years we'd be on the brink of elimination. So they made what seemed impossible possible. And we always have to keep that in mind, that what seems impossible now, we have to imagine as possible, and then we have to create pathways to get there. But the HIV pivot didn't just tweak the system, it actually upended the fundamental assumptions about prevention and reframed the entire response. And it showed us that every part of the system can and must feed into prevention. So I want to bring this back to gender-based violence, because actually what I'm here to talk about. So let's look at the 4 pillars of a public health response. Now, generally speaking, 3 pillars are the usual in public health. Usually recovery's not there. I think, and I could be wrong, but I think gender-based violence is a little unique in having introduced that and quite recently as a pillar. So these are, give or take, the same pillars that informed the HIV prevention strategy and are the same pillars that underpin the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children. Prevention, early intervention, response, and in the latest National Plan launched in 2022, recovery. So the first National Plan ran from 2010 to 2022. Second National Plan runs from 2022 to 2032. Each state and territory is guided by that second National Plan. They have to come up with actions that fit within these 4 categories. So to illustrate this, the National Prevention Agency RWatch uses the river of prevention analogy. So picture a river and I will assist you. There is a river. Upstream on dry land, we see actually faceless, but I'm imagining them smiling, people who have never been touched by violence. So this is the area of primary prevention where education, cultural change and awareness can stop violence before it begins. Then further downstream, you have people who are in the water and they're waving for help. Well, I think they're waving. They don't seem to be waving. But anyway, they've got rafts around them. They probably should be waving. Further downstream, you have people who are in the water. They are definitely waving. And that's where we've parked the ambulance for crisis response. So this is known as, that early intervention is secondary prevention. Down here is tertiary prevention. And it's to help those who've been harmed and reduce the risk of it occurring again. And the point of the image is really that if you concentrate more resources upstream with the faceless but I think smiling people standing on dry land, you won't end up with a river full of drowning people. And it reinforces that sort of linear progress of a hygienic before space and a very sad after space. And RWatch recommends placing the greatest focus on that primary prevention so we don't require so many life rafts and ambulances. And on paper that sounds really reasonable, but I think it really actually oversimplifies the way that we should think about and resource prevention work. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'm just going to go briefly back to HIV prevention. So when the sector pivoted, it actually started using all 4 pillars. If you're negative and you get tested and go on PrEP, well, that's prevention. If you're positive, you intervene early, take medication, that's response. Drop your viral load, that's recovery. And now you're also helping to prevent transmission. But imagine if it was basically saying, if governments were saying, we're only going to fund what you can prove is the prevention part of that. That's what happens in gender-based violence. So these 4 pillars, they don't just shape funding and service delivery, they frame the very way we think about ending violence. So let me show you what that actually looks like in practice. I'm going to use 2 key examples, and I'm going to just, going to not plot spoil there. Firstly, in the response pillar, we generally place things like women's refuges. And women's refuges, they're really one of feminism's, I think, most enduring and effective innovations. But refuges are often dismissed as being that ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, offering crisis support and nothing more. But the best refuges, and I would say the best feminist-run refuges, don't just respond. They actually do the work of all 4 pillars. So they are literally homicide and suicide prevention centres because women and children who are at highest risk of being killed or of suiciding are the ones who are placed in refuge. These are places that women and kids go to hide. It's not just because they can't live in their house anymore, it's that they physically cannot be found, otherwise they are in harm's way. Shelters also provide response, so legal help, financial assistance, social security, counselling, immediate safety. The best refuges also do early intervention with kids who have grown up with that violence, and they support them to recover alongside their mothers by helping them rebuild their lives, sometimes from scratch. And in doing all this, they're engaged in prevention, breaking the cycle so that kids are less likely to become future victims or perpetrators. They also actually quite literally run education programs in schools, like women's community shelters. They run the Walk the Talk Schools program, and they agitate for systemic change. And yet, we mostly fund refuges as if they are only in the response bucket, which means often they are ending up doing far more than they're resourced for, and they're burning out the women who keep them running. So this is why the way we frame these pillars actually matters, because when we treat those 4 pillars as neat separate boxes, or if we imagine violence as this simple before and after event, as the river of prevention implies, we actually end up designing and funding systems that don't match the messy overlapping reality of people's lives, and we under-resource the very services that are doing integrated system-wide work to end violence. The second example I want to take you through is respectful relationships education and consent education in schools. And I know there's one particular person in the audience who have a lot to say about that. But we're not going to quite go there just right now, staying focused. Anyway, but educating young people is the jewel in the prevention crown. So those young people, they are the people on dry land in the prevention imagining. It's where we stop violence before it starts. We challenge gender stereotypes, teach consent and respectful relationships, work to make young people less likely to use violence as teens or adults. But for many children, the violence has already started. And I'm not sure if I'm not going to plot spoil that either. 4 in 10 Australian children are growing up with domestic and family violence. 1 in 3 are subjected to serious emotional abuse. 1 in 4 experience sexual abuse before the age of 18. 3 in 10 are subjected to serious physical violence from a caregiver. And that doesn't even include corporal punishment, which remains legal if it's deemed reasonable for the use of discipline. 60% of young people report being physically punished by a caregiver at least 4 times. Some children are already using violence at home. Some have engaged in harmful sexual behaviour. We're talking about sometimes as young as daycare. This is not high school, it's definitely primary school. Some are already experiencing or perpetrating coercive control in a relationship. So in every classroom, there are victims and there are perpetrators, for want of a better term. It's a bit icky when you apply it to kids. So do these programs shift the attitudes of those most likely to offend? We actually don't know yet. There's not a lot of conclusive evidence, there's almost none in Australia. The evaluations in Victoria, it's the only state where education is mandatory in public schools, doesn't actually include any data on student attitudes, which is wild. The reports do indicate that the attitudes of high school students are more difficult to shift than students in primary school, and I really think any parent of a teenager could have told them that for free, but anyway. I think it's worth noting, as an aside, that according to a recent Lit review on effective sexual violence programs that was conducted by La Trobe University, one of the few programs worldwide that showed strong results is one that teaches young women how to avoid sexual assault. So, digest that for a moment. That's a whole other conversation we can have, and maybe we'll pick up on that. But what we do know is that when you do education in schools, there's one guaranteed outcome. When children are taught about sexual abuse, grooming, consent, coercive control, they recognise it in their own lives. And disclosures go up. And often they'll disclose to the teacher delivering the lesson, maybe another student, might go to the school counsellor, and sometimes those disclosures warrant a police response. And in Victoria, police get 6 reports of child-on-child sexual abuse every week of term, and half of those are from primary schools. So that means that these classes aren't just doing prevention, they're doing early intervention. That's what, no, maybe I didn't do that. Anyway, that's the wrong slide. They're doing early intervention response, and they are aiding with recovery, because actually a positive response to an early disclosure is maybe one of the most important safeguards against ongoing harm in that victim survivor's life, and may actually prevent them from going on to become re-victimised or using sexual violence themselves. So next year, the federal government will mandate respectful relationship education and consent classes in public schools nationwide. And I think there's many questions that we need answered before this rolls out. Are we resourcing schools to respond to disclosures? Do they have any guidance on what happens when there are 2 students involved? Because right now, too often it's the victim who is forced to manage their own safety, which can often mean leaving that school altogether. Now, I know the timer is ticking down. I do want to get through a little bit more, and I know Tom will forgive me. I'm just going to ask for forgiveness later. So I just want to zoom out now and take an eagle-eye perspective on the national plan, and then let's talk a little bit more about the need to interrogate those presumptions and challenge accepted wisdom. So we had that first national plan launched in 2010. Some forms of violence have actually gotten worse, but especially for young people. So the most sobering findings come from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, which started publishing findings in 2022. So what it found, surveying 8,000 Australians, is that 65% overall had experienced some form of child maltreatment. For Australians now aged 16 to 24, adolescent-perpetrated sexual abuse has surged. They are the first generation more likely to have been abused by another child or adolescent than by an adult. And amongst those who have had intimate partners in that same age group, sexual violence has doubled in a single generation. And yet this is the same generation that grew up with the most comprehensive education on respectful relationships and harmful gender norms that we've had. It hasn't been perfect, it's been patchy, but it's been a lot more than the previous generations. So why are they perpetrating more sexual violence? Sexual violence services have been warning about this for years. They say the victims are getting younger, the perpetrators are getting younger, and the assaults are getting more severe. They talk about the fact that whereas things like anal rape were like a very occasional incidents that they came across, now it's daily. They often point the finger squarely at free online porn, which, as we know, has become ubiquitous and has done several things, but one of which is normalised choking, which is literally a leading sign of lethality as a mainstream sexual practice. I had a very strange conversation with the Governor-General of New South Wales, Margaret Beazley, about vanilla sex, and she's right across this, just letting you know. Never forget. We could spend a lot of time expanding on that one point, even just about Governor Beazley, but let's zoom out to the national plan. We have a theory that underpins the national plan, and that is that gender inequality is the primary driver of gender-based violence, so improving gender equality must be the key to ending it. We've invested hundreds of millions of dollars into proving what began as a hypothesis, that if a country could alter its social conditions, improve gender equality, shift community attitudes, loosen rigid gender norms, teach respectful relationships, rates of violence should fall. So the first plan was supposed to see those results by 2019. When that didn't happen, we were given a new horizon. The statistics would likely stay static for at least another decade. And after that, so long as those markers of gender equality improved, the rates of violence would begin to drop. When that will start to happen, or what conditions will be required to make it happen, is actually anyone's guess. It's very hard to see how that's being measured. I think it's really strange that despite the first plan's failure to substantially reduce violence, the second national plan just adopted the same theory of change. There were a few dozen grumpy feminists who implored the government, then the Morrison government, to grapple with what seemed to us to be a crucial question. Why did the first plan fail? It will shock you all to hear that this opportunity for self-reflection was not embraced. But we're in a new time. I love audience members snorting. It's a sign that you're doing well. But we're in a new time with the Albanese government governing until infinity and beyond, seemingly. So should we just have another go at it, this time with a government that's actually interested in improving gender equality and community attitudes? How confident should we be that if we did succeed in improving gender equality and changing those harmful attitudes, we would actually reduce violence or maybe even end it by 2050? Obviously, there is strong evidence that men who perpetrate gendered violence are more likely to feel entitled to women's bodies, hold attitudes that condone violence, and cling to rigid gender roles. They weaponise misogyny and other forms of gender inequality that are baked within systems, persuade doctors that their wife is mentally ill, or present as calm and rational to their mates in the police while their partner is being labelled hysterical. But I think the problem is that just because these attitudes correlate with violence, it doesn't mean that we actually know how to change them, or that changing them will change behaviour. I think the most clear example of that is that some of our biggest wins on attitude change have actually been among young people. So in the National Community Attitude Survey, we've seen measurable improvements in their views on consent and sexual autonomy. And yet, among adolescents, you've had those rates of intimate partner sexual violence double within a generation. So we have to ask, whose attitudes are being changed? Are they the kids who actually would never have used harmful sexual behaviour anyway? Or are we getting a thing where some young people are simply telling researchers what they think they want to hear, while their behaviour tells a different story? I think what's abundantly clear is that it's harder than ever to influence attitudes. So back in 2010, our values were largely shaped by family, peers, pretty homogenised media. But now those points of influence are so fragmented. We live in a globalised sphere of influence. Hardcore pornography, as I said, is ubiquitous, although we've got now forthcoming age restrictions, both on porn and social media, which we'll see if that goes some way to changing that. But we're also contending with this many-headed hydra of the manosphere, which exploits boys' fears and aspirations and feeds them disinformation about women and feminism. And ASIO chief Mike Burgess warned late last year that in one generation, we have allowed our children access to alleyways, content, and people they would never be allowed access to in the physical world. And for some young men, this is hardening hearts and minds against feminism and gender equality. And in 2024, 1 in 5 Australian men aged 18 to 29 agreed that if necessary, feminism should be violently resisted. But the last thing that I will say, and I thank you for your updated timings here, is a deeper challenge, I think, to the gender equality hypothesis. And it's something that's become a bit better known. We certainly raised it in our work, and it's what's known as the Nordic paradox. It's a very pretty place, I've got to say. I would have loved to go to Iceland. The Nordic paradox is basically a term, for those who don't know. It was coined in 2016 when researchers found that among women in the Nordic countries, the most gender-equal societies on earth, reported some of the highest rates of intimate partner violence in Europe. Prevalence rates in Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Denmark and Norway hover around 30%, which is significantly higher than Australia's 1 in 4 rate, but higher than the 22% average across the EU. And I think even more puzzling is that countries with more traditional gender roles often reported lower rates. Spain, for example, came in at just 13%. So this finding, it shook the prevention field worldwide, and I think the people who wrote that paper soon found out there was quite a lot invested in maintaining the fact that gender equality was the answer. So that dominant belief, though, it was suddenly under question, or at least being interrogated, turned upside down, having its pockets emptied out and saying, like, what's in here? What should we be asking? And some researchers argued, well, Nordic women are just simply more willing to report, or they're better at identifying. But there was a collaboration between Spanish researchers and Swedish researchers that was actually commissioned by the Swedish government because they were like, what the fuck? And they found in one of their studies that Spanish women actually report to police at higher rates than Swedish women. Australian researchers found a similar pattern. In 2021, the ANU Crawford School found that Australian women who earned more than their male partners are much more likely to experience physical violence and emotional abuse from them. So what's going on? Is this backlash? Is it men reacting violently to the loss of traditional power? Or is something else at play, something cultural, maybe less to do with gender? Could the Nordic focus on individualism create conditions that enable intimate partner violence? Could Spain's family-centred culture, despite its more traditional gender roles, offer some kind of protection? And what about the promising results we've seen in some developing countries where actually programs that shift attitudes and promote equality have reduced rates of violence? I think the point is there are no simple answers, but the paradox shouldn't be dismissed. We should grapple with it because it challenges the very foundation of our current approach. So none of this means that we should abandon attitude change or gender equality efforts, but it may mean that there are more effective ways to reach those who are at the highest risk of offending. And as Mike and I have been adamant about, you cannot change attitudes in people by simply telling them the right way to think, unless you put them in a re-education camp. But, there's problems with that in a democracy. You need to meet them where they are, and you need to design any messaging about violence with the clear understanding that 65% of the Australian population has experienced child maltreatment. So what can we do? I think we should tease some of that out in the conversation to follow, because I am definitely out of time. But I'll leave this slide here just to ponder. Anyway, thank you so much. So much promo.
Thank you so much, Jess. Thank you, Michael, for being with us. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Bidjigal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. And I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people present today. Always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I just also like to flag that we will be discussing some potentially triggering topics today, so please feel free to take a breather if you need to. And lastly, there will be some time for questions in the end, so please start thinking about what you might like to ask and add your questions to the Slido, and I think some information will be up about how you can do that. Again, so big welcome to you both, Jess and Michael. Thank you so much for that. And, you know, there's lots of light bulb moments happening for me as you were speaking, and a lot of questions as well. Now, you kind of set up the scene there where, you know, this violence against women has been a priority for the last few years, but what is happening is that the strategies are not working. The numbers are going up. And I guess I want you to set the scene a bit, Jess, for us. You know, there has been, you've talked about it in the book, so please buy the books, guys. No, there's been this kind of tussle in the DV sphere between the feminist gender equality model and the psychopathology model in terms of addressing violence against women and children. And you use this beautiful analogy in your first book, this furniture and floor model analogy. I was wondering if you could kind of speak to what these two models are and what this perceived conflict entails. And does it have to be a conflict? I think you mentioned you're arguing for a properly negotiated peace and a lasting end to the war, because there are many practitioners who occupy both sides. So
yeah, sure.
I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit.
I'll try to remember it. Yeah. So thank you, Sarah, and thank you for moderating. Sarah's done so much great work, as Mike introduced, so it's like a real privilege to be interviewed by you. So really the conflict and why it matters is because for a long time it's been almost taboo to talk about, I guess, the pathway from victimhood to perpetration. And by that we mean it's been almost taboo to talk about the role of trauma in perpetration in Australia. And I guess the war, for want of a better term, I mean sometimes it does feel like that, between what you can loosely say is the feminist model. The feminist model is like, it's the patriarchy, stupid. You know, it's gender inequality, it's men's entitlement to women's bodies. They do it because they can, they do it for power and privilege. They do it because they like to exploit women for their labour and resources and their sex. Why wouldn't you if you were able to? That's, you know, that's the basic frame on that. And for the feminist model, understandably, they've watched as various schools of psychology have pathologised victim survivors, have blamed them for their own abuse. They've seen the community excuse perpetrators because they were drunk or because they were drug influenced, etc. And so they've really, I guess, built a bit of a brick wall against those excuses and said, none of that matters. It's all about patriarchy and gender inequality. If that was not the case, none of those extra things would matter. From the psychopathology model, it's like we need to deal with why this particular man or person was violent. What happened in their childhood? Were they substance affected, etc.? They don't traditionally, and this again, there are people who occupy much more of a middle ground. I'm talking about the extreme camps. They often balk at the idea of like this idea of patriarchy and of like there being a cultural underpinning for this violence. And so the house analogy that I gave was basically to say that in the feminist model, you have a room, and in that room you have some furniture. So the room is the man. The furniture could be child maltreatment, could be an alcohol problem, could be a gambling problem. And that furniture's all sitting in the room, and it changes the way that the room looks. But the foundations of the room are gender inequality and patriarchy. And so basically, if you just change the foundations, the rest of it doesn't matter. And I guess the negotiated peace is really the sorts of work that you see from, say, Harvard psychiatrist Judith Herman, who can incorporate both and say we're dealing both with the cultural legacy and continuing reality of patriarchy in all of its forms and gender inequality, and we are dealing with the individual person and their background. And why would you try to separate one from the other? It's just nuts. So that's essentially, and I think where we're at now is we can't keep going just through one narrow perspective or the other, and the two sides should not feel like they're at odds with each other. I think the Victorian Royal Commission kind of tended to favour the feminist model, so things like alcohol regulation and everything was treated as much more of a side issue. There weren't opportunities taken that should have been, and we've had really probably 10 years of wasted time not attending to some of those individual issues.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for setting up that scene. So there's basically two drivers, there's like two drivers of this car called violence against women, and the feminist model, male entitlement, gender stereotyping, and you also have the psychopathology model, child maltreatment, cycles of trauma, substance abuse, alcohol and porn industries, and you need both of these to be addressed. Now, what was mind-blowing to me in that talk that you did was the Nordic paradox, which blew my mind because, for me, my assumption, I guess, from a global south perspective, like a country like Pakistan, okay, if you solve, access to abortion, divorce, financial equality, that's going to resolve DV, right? And then you have a country like the Nordic countries where there's female PMs, there's female ministers, there's still high rates of DV. So what's happening here? Can you tease that out? Like, does one thing work in one context and maybe not another? Does DV become more sophisticated in developing countries or changes? Like, I'm wondering if you could tease out that a little bit more.
Sure, and I'd love Mike to weigh on this actually, because we've chatted about this. We're really like just bouncing theories around because we don't know.
Yeah.
But I think it's clear that you see in some cases, particularly, we've seen when there have been gender equality initiatives in place, like in some South African townships, for example, where they've gone like full pelt to empower women economically, give them more access to independence, but they haven't attended to men in the community. Actually, gender violence rates went up. When they attend to sort of both and really get the men on board for gender equality, then actually you do see violence rates go down. You see in some countries like Nicaragua after the war, where there was really low rates of gender equality, that some work there did reduce those rates. And Mike and I, we've been bouncing around a theory. I'm going to make a really crass analogy just so that it actually is simple to communicate, but excuse me in advance, is that if you have a country that's got really low rates of gender equality and you bring in programs and initiatives that have an impact in a local area, then you get this bump quite quickly. And the bump I've sort of analogized as when you first start exercising after not exercising for 10 years, the first 5 or 6 kilos you lose is really easy. It's your water weight, right? And then the next 10 kilos take you like 5 years. Because actually it's the first part that's like, it kind of drops away. And a lot of that, what is actually quite nonsensical community attitudes about gender inequality and men's and women's roles, sometimes when you start bringing them to communities and you can make it make sense for them in a way that works for their culture, you have these really incredible realisations and you see some change. But in countries like Australia and evidently in Europe, where you've actually got pretty good rates of gender equality across the board, nowhere near what we would like, but it's much more subtle the argument. Like, most Australians think gender inequality has either been achieved or has gone too far. Like, that's the environment we're living in here. We would have different ideas about that. But so trying to pursue a gender equality approach and getting those wins what become smaller and smaller wins, I think they have a diminishing impact. And perhaps, as we've seen, actually have a regressive impact where you start to see either backlash or attitudes aren't catching up with reality, and like those men who are being out-earned in their relationships and using violence. We have to ask why that is, and how do we safeguard women if we're using a gender equality approach against backlash?
Brilliant. Thank you, Jess. We're going to break it down a bit further, how this monster keeps morphing in our societies. Now, Michael, you work in the child abuse and trauma sector. You're an expert, and you've spent a lot of time interviewing and understanding the real-life experiences of people who experience dissociative conditions as a result of abuse and neglect. You've worked on a 2-year study with 40 women who have complex trauma. You've interviewed them and who also experienced domestic violence. What did you find in your study?
I mean, really what we found was just that continuum of gender-based violence from childhood into adulthood, the way that child sexual abuse intersects with domestic violence, which intersects with sexual assault, which intersects with child maltreatment over the course of someone's life. But I think increasingly we need to sort of think beyond just one lifespan, really think about how trauma gets passed down through generations, gets transmitted sort of laterally as well. And I know that sometimes there's resistance to thinking about trauma like this because it sounds like a pathogen or a virus, but I actually think it is a pathogen or a virus. I think that's how it spreads. It's not to say that everyone who's impacted by trauma passes it on. In the same way that, but everyone who has a cold doesn't necessarily give a cold to other people. But it's about the increased risk and the spread and the impact. And so for the women that we interviewed, it was a study that just said to women, do you identify as having complex trauma? And it's a term that Judith Herman created to describe the traumatic effects of gender-based violence. When trauma was first conceptualized in psychology, it was actually mapped onto men's experiences of war. So it was really designed in the 70s around the Vietnam War and the impact on combat vets. But once they took that concept of trauma out to the community, they diagnosed 3 times as many women with trauma as they did with men, despite the fact that it was meant to be honest, a male-dominant condition. And the reason for that was gender-based violence. And so Judith Herman in the early 90s used this term complex trauma to talk about the trauma in interpersonal relationships, trauma that you can't escape, trauma that you can't run away from. And she understood that in terms of child maltreatment, but also gender-based violence. And so speaking to a group of women about their experiences of trauma across their life, and they also talked about the impact on their parenting in all sorts of ways, and then systems. And a big part of the focus for us was that the mental health system was not attentive to women's experiences of violence and abuse. The criminal justice system wasn't attentive. Law enforcement wasn't attentive. Housing, welfare, it just went on and on. And so starting to think about gender-based violence, not just in terms of victims and perpetrators, but also that context where often we have workforces who they want to do their best. They want to make a difference for their clients. But often what we were hearing from women was reaching out for help re-traumatized me. Reaching out for help didn't get the outcome that I wanted. I'd rather just keep this to myself. And so coming out of that project and that study, that was part of the impetus for adding recovery to the national plan in 2022, was saying we can't just fund the response to gender-based violence in terms of crisis. Women have the right, and children have the right, to recover health and well-being after violence. That is a human right. But also, when they are healthier and happier and safer, then there's a protective impact in a whole set of ways.
And I think you talked about something around re-victimization and how abuse clusters in people's lives. And I found that really profound. I'm wondering if you could speak to that a bit as well.
When I was like a little baby researcher back in 2008, in the midst of time, with Jan Breckenridge, who heads up the Gendered Violence Research Network here, who couldn't be here with us tonight, although she really wanted to be. So Jan and I worked on this project on female survivors of child sexual abuse and their experience of alcohol and drug treatment, because we knew that women who have been sexually abused as kids are more likely to use alcohol and drugs. And we were interested in how services in New South Wales were reacting to that. It's interesting when we talk about gender inequality and what we understand that to mean. 90% of people who have an alcohol and drug problem are male, for example. And we can start to think about alcohol and drugs as actually predominantly a male problem. Certainly the service system around alcohol and drugs is really orientated to men, because that's the majority of the clientele. And so we spoke to women who have a sexual abuse history, who were alcohol and drug clients. We spoke to workers in the field as well. And every woman who we spoke to was fleeing domestic violence. And every worker that we spoke to said, well, of course, all of our female clients have a sexual abuse history, but the acute issue they're often presenting with is they're leaving a DV relationship. And so that was the first cue to me that when we were working in the sexual abuse space, especially with the adult survivors, that we're dealing with this sort of cumulative set of experiences. And for me as a sexual abuse researcher to say, oh, well, I just want to talk to you about what happened to you when you were a kid. But this thing that is happening to you right now is not so relevant. That was my first cue that there was this important intersection between child abuse and violence against women. And so then when I started to work more in the primary prevention space about violence against women, it was somewhat frustrating to see this arbitrary division that said, oh, well, what happened to you before the age of 18 is not in scope for our prevention strategy. It's not relevant. And that's what I was told, is not relevant. And I understand there's a different system around child maltreatment in terms of there's statutory obligations, there's a child protection system. I understand that the system is different. But that's not how survivors talk, actually. Yeah.
I think that's really important, because just like racism is an intersection in domestic violence, it seems like child abuse is also just as an important intersection that we haven't explored, and that overlap between child abuse and domestic violence is an important one. You have suggested a more trauma-informed approach to prevention, Michael, and in Jess's book you talk about misogyny as a maladaptive defence, a mechanism that perpetrators use as a coping mechanism. I was wondering if you could talk us through that one.
Loves being controversial, Mike does.
I won't take credit for it. Elizabeth Howell is a feminist practitioner in the United States, and she published work in 2002 looking at the link between childhood trauma and gendered attitudes. And looked at the ways in which, and again, these are generalisations, but men with a trauma history are more likely to hold and display behaviours that we associate with male stereotypes. So they're more likely to be to display externalising behaviours, aggression, really black and white thinking, particularly around gender and about male dominance. But also in a clinical setting for therapists who are working with female survivors of sexual abuse, they're often dealing with a lot of self-blame, shame, internalised aggression in the sense that female survivors are much more likely to self-harm, for example, and then also be targeted in their adult relationships by abusive men. And so the broader point that Elizabeth was making was that there is in society there's a traumagenic aspect to misogyny. And so that for men who have experienced the shame and humiliation and powerlessness of childhood abuse, misogyny offers a kind of narcissistic defense that says, actually, because I'm a man, I have these entitlements and I have the right to X, Y, Z. And that if we're going to unpack that defense mechanism. He needs something in to replace it. If what misogyny for that man is doing is protecting him from the humiliation and shame that he can't tolerate, if we take it away, he needs something in response that's going to work for him. So I think that this is, again, just a useful reflection on the intergenerational and collective nature of trauma, and also and misogyny and its collective function. It's working for men and boys in a particular kind of way. It's giving them something. I actually don't particularly buy the feminist argument that misogyny and male entitlement is fun and enjoyable, and it's just power over is something that anybody will grab if they can get their hands on it. It's not my model of human flourishing. I don't think it is an equitable model of human flourishing, and I don't think it expresses men's nature. I think misogyny is doing something for men and boys, and we need to figure it out and give them something else.
And Jess, you mentioned in your book this line which stuck with me: violence is like cocaine, moving shame into grandiosity. You feel big and strong and invincible, and it works, but it creates havoc in your world. Now, it is hard, but I think it's necessary to tackle this complex inner world of abusers, which you describe. And it's, I guess, entitlement, but married with, you talk about trauma, shame, humiliation, insecurity, and the need for control, as all kind of linked in this kind of toxic cocktail of domestic violence. I was wondering if you could talk us through that.
I can try. I mean, I think Mike went some ways to doing that. I think sometimes what we see as entitlement is also like disregard for others. And I think, that rigid style of thinking is also one of the, what literally creates, and I don't use this term lightly, an evil kind of behaviour. Because it's this sense that, I think where the traditional modes of masculinity come into it, and I'm very much citing Terry Real here, who was, who that quote comes from, is that if I'm not won over, I'm won under, and that if I'm not winning, I must be losing. So in order for me to win, you have to lose in this equation. And honestly, when you see this play out again and again in relationships, but particularly in post-separation abuse, and I've seen it play out in my own life, not with my own partner, but with friends and their ex-partners who were previously great friends of mine and my partner, where you see guys who have just a trace of visible insecurity, quite strong attachment to more traditional masculinity, not very overt about traditional gender roles until the woman challenges or leaves and says, I'm due half of your earnings, or I'm due half the house. And suddenly it's like this, I'm going to basically destroy you, I'm going to destroy your life, but even to the point where they're destroying their own life, because in the end, I have to win and you have to lose. And as Mike was saying, a lot of what I wrote about in the original book, See What You Made Me Do, was about shame as the root cause of violence, and this deeply unacknowledged shame that becomes malignant in someone. And I think, at the time that I wrote the book, and even more so now, Donald Trump was kind of the archetype of that. In his first presidency, he was having arguments on Twitter with faceless avatars, who he felt had slighted him. There are people who are so shame sensitive, and so it becomes like a distortion in their perception, where they believe that you have disrespected them, even when all you've done is just ask them to wash the dishes, or you've accidentally burnt the toast. And it's like, you did that on purpose. You did that on purpose because you want to win and you want to see me lose. And that, win or lose a world kind of perspective, I think really underpins this. And that's why I guess we try to come at things around, trying to make more space in what masculinity can mean for people who are attached to it. But ultimately, unless you get to the really deep-seated reasons for that shame and that fear, essentially, that these men have, none of the gender re-education is going to wash, because as Mike says, they're using it as a defence. They'll use whatever they can as a defence. They'll use racism as a defence. They'll use whatever it is that makes them have one over the other person, because ultimately what they're seriously afraid of is being seen for the defective person that they are, the defective person they believe themselves to be. And they cover that so often with a firewall of grandiosity. And it's like, if I just keep this firewall of grandiosity and callousness towards my partner, but projected generosity and, great guy image to the rest of the community, I'll be protected from that little boy who was never good enough, was never man enough, was never strong enough, from that little boy ever being known. And the horrible thing about that is that victim survivors, they can see that little boy and they want to know that little boy and they want to show that little boy that he can be loved. And I'm talking obviously male-female binaries here, but in this situation it's so often the case. And they will throw themselves on the pyre to prove to that little boy that he can be loved. And in the end, the only one who can show him that he can be loved is himself. And that's what so many women end up finding out.
And Jess, I think it seems to us unfathomable that someone who is so powerful and is doing all these destructive things can experience themselves as so small, but this is part of the psychosocial model. And I guess I do want to talk about that attitudes behaviour paradox that you mentioned as well. And there's just so much great stuff in the book, and I do want to mention it a bit, in terms of the limits of gender equality campaigns and surveys, because you write, it's difficult to ascertain how a person will behave when they are drunk or when their attachment issues are triggered if all you're doing is asking them questions in a controlled environment. And you quote an expert who wrote, I measure attitudes knowing how contradictory people can be. That shows particularly in the realm of violence and control, because the tendency to be abusive is something deeper than culture. It's deep within the body. It's a psychological impulse. And there was amazingly someone you quoted in the book, Rebecca Huntley, who wrote the book Sassafras, a memoir about the intense personal physical violence she experienced as a child. And she writes, you write, my father was a professor of law, a champion of women in the workplace. He supported women to be judges. If you had given him a survey, he would have ticked every right box, yet he was a horrible father. Now, that's pretty intense, this difference between our explicit beliefs and our implicit beliefs, attitudes and behaviour. So in terms of what works, how do you actually change people? You've spoken about 3 programs in your book that actually do work. Safe Steps, Shifting Boundaries, and She Is Not Your Rehab. So to move this in a positive direction, what works, in terms of actually changing behaviour, not just on a superficial attitudes level? If you could talk us through those 3 programs.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll try to recall the Safe Dates and Shifting Boundaries. I think that, interestingly, Safe Dates is an American education curriculum on respectful relationships. It was evaluated sort of late 90s, early 2000s, and only in a certain area of America. So it's still, I think, up for grabs as to whether, if it were evaluated now, would we see the same reductions to perpetration and changes in attitudes. But the evaluations are sound, and they did find that there was both the changes in attitudes and improvements and reductions in perpetration among the young people who received it. I think central to it was not just we're talking about gender roles and what constitutes respect, but also role playing. So they would put on theatre productions. The students, they would host like poster competitions. They get very involved, and apparently that, according to a whole meta review of these sorts of programs globally, that was one of the things that differentiated Safe Dates from other programs that really hadn't seen those results. Is really getting the kids like kind of viscerally, personally involved. The Shifting Boundaries example I thought was so interesting because it took a lot of what Safe Dates did, replicated it to the extent that you can, but found that when they did the classroom education, it didn't reduce behaviour and perpetration. What did reduce perpetration was changing the environment. So they brought in classroom-level intervention orders where there had been allegations of assault between students. They asked students where were the places on campus that felt unsafe, and they brought in more lighting, they put more security in those areas. They actually changed the living conditions that the students were inhabiting, and that's what reduced perpetration. That, combined with the education, also reduced perpetration. She Is Not Your Rehab essentially what Mike and I have been advocating for, not because we had the idea first, it just so happens that they have, that's what they're doing, is that it is a trauma-informed approach to prevention. It is one that says, and literally, and I'm quoting Matt Brown, who's one of the drivers of this with his wife Sarah, "Brother, I know how hard it is to heal. Your trauma was not your fault, but your healing is your responsibility." And I find their work extraordinary. I've had a very immersive experience with it. I was part of a group of Aboriginal and Pacifica community leaders who did a 3-hour program with them about how do we bring this work to the people we're working with. And it required us to look at the stuff that we hide from. It required us to do even things like stand in front of a mirror and say what we liked about ourselves. Half of the people in that room just wanted to run away. They could barely stand in front of a mirror and say what they liked about themselves. And these are people who lead this work. We all ended up in total puddles on the floor. It was like a bit of a psychosocial hazard at one point. But anyway, I was in a puddle probably about 3 minutes in. So that was a long 3 hours for me. But they have this app called Inner Boy, and it's basically like a 30-day guided program for a lot of guys who are either not going to seek help from a traditional counsellor, have tried and found it really disappointing, or cannot even get there, can't afford it, whatever. So it's free, it's guided by Matt. He's obviously got a really extensive and intense trauma and violence background. And it really conveys that. It's like, we're going to help you get into that moment where you're about to do what your father or your uncle or whoever or your mother did to you. We're going to get in that moment and we're going to just give you more time to breathe, talk to that little boy inside you and just have a different option. And one of the amazing examples they gave was of this guy who'd grown up with pretty extreme violence, and he's woken up in the morning, the dishes are unwashed, and he's like, I told my 15-year-old boy to wash the dishes last night and he didn't do it. He's disrespected me. I have to go in now and I have to discipline him, which means physically punish him, because he needs to know that I'm setting a boundary. And what he had learned through the Inner Boy app was just basically to stop at the sink and take a minute and reflect. He managed to just take that minute and reflect and go, is that the entirety of what's happened? And is that what used to happen to me? And what he remembered is, yes, that's what used to happen to me. My father would come and lash me when I hadn't done that. In that moment that he took to reflect, his wife comes into the kitchen. Instead of blowing up at her, like, why didn't you get him to do the dishes last night? He just takes a beat and says, the dishes aren't done. Is there any reason why he didn't do that? And his wife says, well, yeah, actually, he had a really hard time at school yesterday. He was bullied. He came home really upset. And in that moment, this man just stands there and thinks, this is the moment I have to be there for my son. He goes into the bedroom and sits with his son and has a conversation and gives him a cuddle. And just that's the stuff where I'm like, the only way we're going to prevent violence is if we get in between and into those moments where someone is going to exert control or use manipulation or use violence and persuade them that it is in their interests and the interests of the people that they apparently love not to do that. And for some sociopath or people who are so callous and so cut off from their own emotions, this will never work. And we as a society just need to manage those people. And sometimes that means just finding a way to warehouse them, put a bloody monitoring bracelet on them, because there's nothing that you can do. Mm-hmm. But with a sizable section of men who use coercive control and sexual violence, there are possibilities. And we have to at least try to work with them. But it has to be on them.
Thank you for that, Jess. And that makes sense because this issue is just so... Oh yeah, a round of applause for that. No. Thank you. And this issue is so pervasive, so it cannot be... That cannot be the case that you need to resolve it using these approaches. So it's really that behaviour interrupting approaches that are working.
With some people.
With some people. Now, Michael, you've spoken about how, victims of trauma are overrepresented in emergency departments, in prisons as homeless. You talk about the cycle of violence. And in terms of what has worked, you've spoken about a one-stop shop for survivors as being pretty effective. What is this one-stop shop and why does it work?
Part of the research project we were talking about earlier was just asking women what would they like. I mean, they talked to us about what didn't work when they approached services, but also what would be helpful. And really starting to think about, taking services or service provision that's place-based. It's in your community. It's staffed by people that are from your community. And instead of, to get your mental and physical and psychosocial and legal needs being addressed all over town, so if you're in the middle of a complex situation where there's a lot going on for you, you've got 6 different appointments in the week and you're running around the place, but you've also got childcare obligations and all sorts of things are going on, what it would mean just to have one place where you could go and you could get your needs met. And also there would be some information sharing. So your physical health care is related to your mental health care, but also people are realising, there's a legal matter and there's a child protection matter, and can we help you fill out your Centrelink, or what about your NDIS applications, and all of these things that women were finding themselves entangled with, what it would be like to go somewhere where there was just sort of one place. And so this was something that we sort of put together as part of the project based on women's recommendations. And it's been taken up in different sorts of ways, and not just because of our research. There's been sort of broad activism around this and advocacy. And so the Illawarra Trauma Recovery Centre, the Women's Trauma Recovery Centre, involved the practitioners co-designing the service for women who have a trauma history. And it's designed to, in some cases, provide an oasis from a currently violent situation, but at the same time acknowledging women have kids and everyone has needs, and they have physical health needs and mental health needs. The Commonwealth has also funded 6 primary health networks around the country to adopt a recovery-orientated response to violence. And that idea of a recovery-orientated response that just says, what's happening and what do you need? What would help? And it's really interesting what helps, because there can be a whole set of issues. There can be long-term, yes, violence and abuse, but then chronic pain. And we know that a lot of women who have experienced trauma and abuse go on to live with high levels of pain that are not being addressed by their GP, that have just been normalised, that can be really debilitating, that then reinforce depression and anxiety. What about just food? What about your diet? What about exercise? What about psychosocial skills? All of these things. So that was really sort of the challenge that we proposed as part of the research project. And it'll be really interesting to see the evaluations from Illawarra, but also the public health networks that the Commonwealth has funded to adopt a model like this and say to people, again, if your health, if your well-being is impacted by violence and abuse, you have the right to recovery. You have the right to the restoration of your health and to go on and live a healthy life.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. And I just briefly want to condense some of these amazing questions that we've got from the audience. Quickly, Jess, I thought it would be worth bringing this in because you've talked about it in the book. People are asking about how do we support men's emotional, psychosocial development in a way that prevents gender violence. People are talking about Andrew Tate and the manosphere. And I guess that's something I did want to kind of address because it was kind of mind-blowing to me in the book, where you talk about it's not just Andrew Tate and the podcasters and the manosphere. There's something a lot more insidious and systemic going on with that, to the tune of over $700 million, I think. What is this funding? Where is it coming from? And what is it doing? We are in this kind of toxic online stew of misogyny that is kind of weaponizing a lot of these feelings of shame and humiliation men are experiencing into this kind of world. So yeah, what is this money? Where is it coming from? And how is it kind of fueling this?
Well, just briefly, basically, this money is coming from anti-rights organisations, can be fundamentalist Christian organisations across the EU and the States, can be, far-right think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, famous for Project 2025, thanks, beautiful work, and other, basically loosely affiliated groups who unfortunately all, although they disagree on a number of things, they all agree on one thing, and that is that gender equality and the rights for LGBTQI people should be undermined. So they're very united on that front. I spoke to the ambassador for gender equality about this, Stephanie Copus-Campbell, who's now the former ambassador, so I can actually cite her on this. At the time, it was a bit like, don't quote me. And literally don't quote me because I'm having to go into these meetings in the States and I'm concerned that if I'm on paper saying these things, I literally will not get the meetings that I need to get. But she was basically just saying that she had been to something horrendous, like over 100 countries in 18 months. And she was seeing the same language turn up in Malawi, in Papua New Guinea, in Florida. It was like the same lines that were being planted everywhere. And everywhere she went, the legislation that had been achieved, like, same-sex marriage or, the right to same-sex relationships in Uganda, were being turned around. And it's a concerted effort to drive back the gains that have been made over the last 30, 40, 50 years. They spend money really effectively. I don't even think, Stephanie was saying that progressive movements are actually outspent. I think with a few high-profile divorces like Melinda and Bill and Mackenzie and Jeff, we've actually got some very rich women who are now quite intent on funding gender equality efforts. So for reasons that they have not yet divulged. But I think that, I don't think it's that we're outspent. I think the problem is that progressive movements often fight amongst ourselves and perhaps aren't spending that money as effectively. To be honest, it's also a lot easier to undo stuff than it is to do things. It's a lot easier to lead from fear. It's a lot easier to, unfortunately, they can exploit all sorts of narratives. They can exploit, they can basically use this idea of a decadent West where, the colonizer is affiliated with LGBTQI rights and gender equality and all the rest of it, and go into these, post-colonial countries and say that essentially for you to be post-colonial, you need to reject the values of the West. So they can exploit whatever it is to get this message across, and they do it supremely effectively. And I think that, unfortunately, what we were talking about, like shame-based men who've experienced things in childhood that then put them in this win-or-loser mindset and rigid thinking. Unfortunately, that's a lot of guys in Silicon Valley who are now sort of setting the agenda for the brave new world that we're all walking into. And you saw them all standing behind Trump at his inauguration, and everyone's just like, waiting for cookies at the table. And that's scary. It's also setting what we see online. Like the algorithms, all of those things, these aren't accidental. And the fact that we see rise of, trends like trad wives and all the rest of it, this is being supported by those anti-rights actors. It's being supported by very deep pockets. It's not just, organically, these people seem to rise to the surface because they're rage baiting or whatever. There's a lot more going on. And now, unfortunately, Russia and America are, to some extent, in lockstep around opposing the more progressive values of the West. It used to be Russia versus the West. Now it's Russia and America versus the West, apparently. So that's a very difficult spot to be in. And it's filtering through trade negotiations, removing gender from trade negotiations. I mean, it's everywhere, and they are very determined. And Project 2025 was pretty much a roadmap for that and for authoritarianism.
I think that was really mind-blowing. Reading that, it was just the tip of an iceberg. These manosphere and these social media influencers are actually funded in a very deliberate, systemic way. So that's a really systems issue, I think, that is really important. So thank you for that. Now, look, I just wanted to, I know we don't have that much time left, but before we leave, I did want to end with, something hopeful. Now, Michael, it can be depressing, this idea of re-victimization and the loops people find themselves in, especially vulnerable people. And as an expert, you've spoken about how vicarious trauma can be challenging for people supporting others who've experienced complex trauma. But you also speak about this idea of vicarious resilience. And what a life-affirming and even joyful process it is for you to work with and learn from survivors who've made changes, who've broken cycles. So I was wondering if you could speak to that, and what do you find most hopeful about the work you do?
As part of this project, we were interviewing workers who their primary work's in complex trauma. And so we were asking them about the impact of the work and burnout and all of those things. And we had this woman who just said, I'm so sick and tired of being asked this question. She said, I love my work. She said, I love the people that I work with. And I love coming to work every day. And she said, I don't have to leave my work behind when I go home because what I take home with me is so much hope. And it was a bit of a sort of a slap in the face for us as researchers. And so we went back, we looked at all of the interviews that we'd done. We'd done 60, and we just saw time after time these workers just talking about these incredible clients and these and how much they admired their clients and how much they learnt from them and how much they grew. And so we started writing about not just vicarious trauma and getting traumatized because you work with people who are traumatized, but actually what you learn from victims and survivors because of their resilience. And that is absolutely what gets me out of bed in the morning every day. Is just you meet the most incredible people doing this work, and that is true for the survivors, that's true for the workers, and often the workers are also survivors. People often ask me how I do the work, and it's not hopeless. It doesn't feel hopeless at all. Part of Jess and my paper last year and the conversations we've been having is there's so many opportunities to prevent violence that we're not taking, and we could, and the levers are right in front of us. And that's part of my frustration is we've sort of gotten stuck on a couple of key concepts that are maybe not working. That's okay. I thought things 10 years ago that I don't think anymore. There's no shame in saying, okay, well, we tried something, it didn't work, we're going to do something else. We're going to augment something we've been doing. We're going to backstop it with some other approaches. So I really don't want anyone to leave tonight thinking we can't do this. I absolutely think that we can do this. I absolutely think we can do this. I think the fight is tough, and some of the fight is with the technology sector, for example, and our online information hygiene. Part of our fight is around pornography, which is bad for children, and we shouldn't give it to them, but also it's not great for adults either, and we probably should do something about that. Alcohol is an issue. It is an issue. Men have a problem with alcohol, and part of that problem is the more we drink on average, the more violent we get. So the less alcohol there is. Gambling is a problem. Like, we could list it, and Jess and I have listed these opportunities. So it's out there, and my hope is, okay, America's going to hell in a handbasket. That seems to me to be their problem. But we've got a decent government that I think wants to do something and frankly feels on the hook for it. If in 5 or 10 years' time, violence is not going down, we will all be holding them accountable for that, and they know it.
And they'll still probably be in government. So,
Thank you so much, Michael. Now, Jess, last question for you. You know, you've spoken about people who choose, the path of least resistance, violence, which, instead of vulnerability, they choose control. And the knots of violence and aggression in our human family feel so fraught. After speaking to you, it's not as simple as we think. But you do talk a lot about neuroplasticity in the book, and how do you think we can change our brains, our wiring, and our society? What makes you hopeful for change?
Yeah, of course. It takes a lot of work, though. Like, as someone who's gone to therapy myself for many, many years and is now at the age of 42, thanks probably a little bit to menopause or perimenopause, discovering that I actually didn't know myself at all, really, until 2 weeks ago. And now I probably will find things out in 5 years. But that's from going over that neural pathway again and again and again, basically, if you've got these neural pathways in your brain that have been set up by certain experiences and they've got like deep grooves, you need to establish new pathways, and you need to do it again and again and again and again. And that's not even if you've got like deeply habituated, problems like substance abuse or the use of violence. Even people who are just dealing with garden variety kind of maltreatment and attachment issues have to do that work. And it's long and it's lifelong. The last thing I'd say is that I think one of the best conversations I had, aside from the one with Mike, obviously, for the quarterly essay, was with Cheryl Batchelor, who is an Aboriginal woman running Yilia Pinya, which works with basically the children that nobody else wants to work with, who are essentially going towards a youth justice response. And she really said, when the kids she's working with are like, Auntie, it's just my trauma, there's nothing we can do. She's like, this is not just your trauma. You've had hard times, but we're talking about brain health, and we're going to cuddle your brain, and we're going to teach it that it can expect better, and then we're going to help you learn how to expect that and how to give that. And I won't go into the particular story now that she told me, which was extremely harrowing. But one thing that they do is this thing called Made by Mob. So every week they'll have this carpentry thing where they bring, the mum and son. Often the son's sort of maybe used violence in the home or used harmful sexual behaviours. There's been massive problems, and they'll come together with a carpenter and they'll make a table. Sounds lovely, except for the fact that there's a 15-year-old boy with a hammer and a saw and large pieces of wood, and you're having to sit there and just let him hammer nails right next to you. You're maybe a bit dysregulated from your own experiences of violence. But they basically have this space where they say, you're going to get triggered in all the wrong ways right now, and we're going to help you regulate as you do this practice together. And at the end of it, you're going to come out having produced something together. And we're going to do this again and again and again. And we're also going to do this in ways that feel culturally sound for you. We're going to take you out on country. We're going to log you back into why you would even want to create these neural pathways, why you wouldn't just throw in the towel altogether. And Cheryl is just so great. She's just she came to the work because she read Norman Doidge's The Brain That Changes Itself, and she was like, yeah, fuck yeah, why don't we just change the brain? Let's change some brains.
Change some brains. I love that. I think that's a perfect note to end on. The power of change and how abuse goes a long way, but care can go a long way too. And this is such an intractable problem, so I think we need to throw everything we have at it. So I appreciate both of you. Thank you so much. I think I could talk to you for another hour.
Thank you,
and
Sarah.
Please give a round of applause to our speakers.
Thank you.
And just a reminder, everyone, that books are available for signing, so please come and, buy a book if you want, and feel free to grab some food as well. Thank you so much.